here's your office lease.
Thank you, Bonnie. I want to paint you a picture. You're a business decision maker who just negotiated the business terms for the office space of your dreams. And now you have one final document, the office lease. Now, how are you supposed to know how to negotiate an office lease? Short of having a legal degree, there are hundreds of lease clauses and business language that require hours of painstaking review. So today, we're going to solve all that for you because we have exclusive access to Bryce Kustra and Paul Taylor, partners at Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt, LLP, one of Canada's top nationwide law firms with one of the industry-leading commercial real estate groups. Now, both Bryce and Paul are going to give you insight on exactly how to negotiate the office lease. My name is Sean Clark, Vice President at Avison Young, and welcome to Office Uncovered. Bryce, Paul, thank you guys so much for sharing your insights today with our viewers. Do you mind giving us a bit of insight into yourselves first and some of Osler's scope of services?
Sure thing, Sean, and thanks again for coming in. So I've been practicing real estate law for over 12 years now. That includes leasing, buying and selling commercial buildings, development work, and sort of everything under the commercial real estate sun. Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt is a full-service national business law firm with real estate lawyers in 4 offices that can help clients from start to finish on their commercial real estate transactions.
That's great. And Paul, yourself?
Sean, thanks again for coming in. It's a pleasure. I've been practicing commercial real estate law for over a decade. Similar to Bryce, I handle commercial real estate transactions, leasing matters, general real estate, which is a nice complement to my financial services practice, which focuses primarily on mortgage loans.
Awesome.
As you know, I've had the pleasure to work with you and a number of clients over the years with respect to leases and lease reviews and negotiations. We're really excited to talk about commercial leasing with you today.
Yeah, and we're excited, and you said it's been great working together as a team, so look forward to what's next. Thanks for the insight. Bryce, do you mind sharing the top 3 things that business decision makers should be wary of in their office lease?
Yeah, happy to, Sean. Paul and I were discussing this before the meeting today, and our top 3 would be assignment restrictions. So when landlords consent to an assignment or a change of control might be required. Operating costs in the lease, so how they're calculated, inclusions, exclusions, reconciliations, and dispute mechanisms. And then tenant move-out obligations when the end of the term is up.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Do you mind telling Sean and the viewers what's important for a tenant to know about assignment provisions in a lease?
Yeah, of course. So selling a business is a major event, and it's important that it goes smoothly. Of course. However, whether a tenant is assigning the lease to a purchaser or selling their business through the sale of shares, many leases require landlord consent to that transaction with the lease. Yeah. In addition, many leases give the landlord a termination right when the tenant requests that consent from the landlord. But from the tenant's perspective, how can you sell a business if you don't have a place to operate? Of course. On the flip side of the coin, suppose a tenant has too much space and wants to reduce expenses. In that case, many tenants may look at leasing the excess space to a third party, which is called subleasing. Again, landlord consent is often required, and many leases will set out parameters on who the tenant can sublease to. So when we're acting for tenants on leases, these are some of the main clauses that we negotiate for the tenant to try and maximize their flexibility in the future.
And that's great, right? Because, in Calgary's market, things are always changing.
Absolutely.
So key to flexibility is great.
Yeah, well said, Bryce. You're really looking out for the tenant's best interest, making sure that that lease is drafted in such a way that when things change with respect to the tenant's business, the lease will work for the tenant's business and have the most flexibility it can.
Agreed.
So, Paul, number 2, building operating costs, probably some of the most annoying changes for tenants. Do you mind giving your perspective on the matter?
Sure. When I talk about operating costs, I'm going to talk about a net lease as opposed to a gross lease. For the viewers, a gross lease is a lease where a tenant pays a fixed amount for rent, and the landlord will pay the operating costs out of that amount. So the landlord will bear the risk of increased and fluctuating operating costs. Okay. Whereas the majority of leases in downtown Calgary, office leases, are triple net leases or net leases, where a tenant will pay a basic and minimum rent, In addition, they'll pay their proportionate share of operating costs. Okay, and those operating costs, the risk of those fluctuating in a net lease is borne on a tenant. And accordingly, it's very important for a tenant to understand how the operating cost provisions work in the lease so that it understands what it's going to be charged over the duration of the term.
Of course, because it fluctuates, right?
Right. And the last thing a tenant wants when they're trying to have certainty for their business is a big surprise and an increase in operating costs that they weren't expecting. So best advice is to understand how the lease provisions work and understand exactly how they're going to be charged, how they're going to be determined, and how they can ascertain whether they've been charged appropriately.
And that's totally fair.
Yeah, and at a high level, generally, the operating costs for a tenant will be determined by taking the square footage of the premises divided by the total rentable square footage of the building. That'll give you a percentage, and you multiply it by the total operating annual costs. And then what'll happen is the landlord will provide an estimate at the beginning of the term.
Yeah.
Okay, that estimate will basically give them an idea of what they're expected to pay each month based on what the costs are expected to be for the building. Okay, what's important for a tenant to know is at the end of the term, they'll be given a statement, usually within 30 to 90 days of the end of the term, and the landlord will determine what their actual costs were in relation to operating costs. Okay. What a tenant needs to know is, with respect to that statement, they want to make sure the lease provides that the landlord will provide reasonable detail on what those operating costs are.
Okay.
Okay, so they don't want to just be given a number. They want to understand the breakdown of what's included and what they're being charged.
Yeah.
Right? It would be helpful for a tenant to have a clause in the lease where if they ask for the backup documentation, the invoices, the receipts, the landlord's obligated to provide them.
Oh, you can ask for those.
You can do it. I mean,
Great.
these are the kind of things Bryce and I will negotiate just to make sure. I mean, if you're going to have a dispute with your landlord, and hopefully you don't, if anything, it's likely about money, and it's likely going to arise with respect to an interpretation of the operating cost definition and the mechanisms with respect to determining how a tenant is charged.
Okay, great.
You'd agree with that, Bryce?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one other thing for tenants to keep in mind is that there's often a fixed timeline for them to review or dispute any of those operating costs.
Fair.
So, you have to be a little bit on the ball, and you can't just let it sit there.
Well, and that's why they want to come to you right away and make sure that they're aware of what their costs are if they have any type of discrepancy.
Right. It's a balance. I mean, you want to make sure there's a dispute mechanism in the lease, but you want to balance this with good business with your landlord. The last thing you want to do is at the outset of the lease irritate them by making them think you're going to be a pain in the butt tenant, right?
Yeah, fair.
You don't want to do that. So, but you want to make sure that there's a mechanism in there to either have an audit done, potentially, or to have a third party just determine the dispute if there is a dispute on operating costs. Without that, your only recourse is to really sue your landlord and force them to provide the documentation to determine the issue.
Okay.
And that's the last thing you want to do, right?
Okay, so upfront communication, working with you at the onset, make sure that communication is clear and we look at that breakthrough.
That's right. The last thing I want to talk about that's really important, generally at a high level, operating costs are defined as the repair and maintenance costs with respect to the building. Okay. You'll see a laundry list of inclusions in a lease. Okay. What is most important for a tenant is to have a balanced lease where we've got reasonable, appropriate exclusions from operating costs. Landlord's goal is to make sure they can pass as many of the costs on to the tenants as possible. The tenant's goal is to ensure that they're paying the fair share of the costs, right? So some typical exclusions would be structural repairs, okay? Cost of structural repairs, market in Alberta is, the landlord's on the hook to pay those. Other exclusions would be you're not paying for leasing costs with respect to leasing up the unit that's vacant beside you. There's a laundry list of exclusions, and again, what's reasonable will really come down to the circumstances and the leverage you have as a tenant. If you're taking a small space, you're going to have less leverage to be able to negotiate this. If you're an important tenant, an anchor tenant in the building, you're going to have more ability to negotiate these terms. And if you're taking more space, it's probably more important to pay more attention to these. So there's a number of factors that we'd call market factors. Bryce and I do this every day. We would know what's appropriate, what's reasonable, what'll get the deal done for your tenant, right? We're not there to do a make work project. We're just there to make sure that the lease is level, it's balanced, and it will fairly protect the tenant moving forward. So,
Well, and that's what I'm hearing from you guys, right? It's like, it's what's fair, what's common, right? And you see so many leases and you do so many negotiations that you're aware of what's fair and what is not fair. So I appreciate the insight on that.
yeah, the last thing I'll note, I mean, in summary, tenant wants to understand what they can be charged, what's fair for them to be charged, how they're going to be charged in terms of repair and maintenance, and it's best to do this up front. Take the time and have the lease reviewed before you're dealing with this halfway through the term, and you got to dispute with your landlord about what you should be paying and not paying.
Okay, awesome. Well, appreciate it, guys. Yeah, I think that's incredibly insightful. So Bryce, we started with assignment language, then we went to operating costs. Do you mind rounding it out with the tenant move-out obligation language and your insight?
Sure, absolutely, Sean. So at the end of the term, many leases have an obligation on the tenant that they would have to either remove any improvements the tenant made to their space, or even demolish the space down to base building condition.
Which is expensive.
And time consuming.
Yeah.
So that has two factors on the tenant. So that's one of the reasons we review the clause with the tenant and negotiate it in the lease.
Of course.
Further, one issue that we've seen has come up for tenants on move-out situations at the end of the term is uncertainty over which improvements they are responsible to remove and which ones the landlords are responsible for.
Complex.
The reason for that is often that just through the course of time, those records got lost. And it's important to the tenant because there's cost and time involved.
Yeah.
So when we negotiate the lease, it's important that the lease clearly set out those improvements that the tenant is responsible to remove.
Yes. Okay, awesome.
Bryce, one thing to add, you said it to me a number of times. Best practice, do a walkthrough at the beginning of the lease, document it, right? And then get ahead of these move-out obligations early prior to the termination. Make sure it's clear and you're not dealing with a dispute on the last hour of the lease. Deal with it early, get your list, make sure you know what those obligations are, and you can satisfy it, right? The last thing you want to do is be stuck doing them after the term and arguably overholding on the lease, right?
Well, and a consistent, I think, line across all of your points is open communication and as early as possible to make sure that everyone is clear about what the actual obligations are, anything throughout the lease.
Proactive planning.
Yeah. So, gentlemen, I really appreciate the time on the top through list. I think it's going to offer extreme insight into the clients and the viewers' negotiations on their lease, and really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. And if any of the viewers needed to get a hold of us, we're happy to chat with them. So my email address is bkustra@osler.com. And then Paul?
Yeah, ptaylor@osler.com. I mean, we're here. You got any questions, comments? Doesn't matter if we've got a file. You want to talk leasing? Give us a call. We've got a team. We'll make sure we help you out and give you practical advice and help you with your issue.
Awesome. And we will leave your contact details in the body of the video and in the email that everyone will receive, so they'll be able to easily contact you with any questions they have. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Paul. Once again, my name is Sean Clark, Vice President Avison Young, and thanks for watching Office Uncovered. Until next time.